Chapter 3 Foul Sorcery.
On another world, a man stood on the roof of a lighthouse. The wind and the rain whipped about his large, multicoloured robe, causing it to flutter and flap like bedsheets put out to dry on a blustery day. Far away, midway between the horizon and the mound of rock on which the lighthouse sat, was a ship, its mast, aft and stern lights were the only visible points against the black of the night. The moon was full, yet the sky was choked with low, brooding cloud, and so the coast and the choppy sea were overrun with vast, dark and fleeting shadows. It was a devilish night. It was a night fit for skullduggery. The sorcerer, his arms outstretched, rolled and reeled his head. He was laughing like a maniac. His teeth, white against the dark of the night, seemed as large and as prominent as the score of rocks that pierced the sea between the lighthouse and a distant ship. This ship was laden with foodstuffs, spices, gold and precious stones. The night crew maintained their coast-hugging course. They kept themselves busy by bagpiping the mizens, bracing the yards, clapping a service in the horse and surging the capstan. The majority of the crew slept peacefully in hammocks in the bowels of the ship. Below the lighthouse, within the supporting granite spit, were crevices and caverns. Most of these had been formed by the action of the tide and other natural forces, but some had been fashioned more recently. Supernatural forces had extended and added to what nature had already created, to form catacombs large enough to hide a small army. The sorcerer clapped his hands once above his head, and the sound of 1,000 screams rose up to replace the shrill whistle of the wind. Below the lighthouse, where the sea licked away at the base of the mound, the water started to churn and froth. Creatures with great jointed limbs broke the surface briefly, only to disappear and head out to sea. They were moving straight for the ship. No one on board saw the vast single shadow of the approaching army until it was too late. The ship fetched away at first, rolling portside as a mass of enormous crabs scuttled and clambered up over the sides. Some sailors stirred in their sleep, disturbed by the sound of scratching and scraping against wood, but most continued dreaming of finer places, finer food, and fine female company. When the first of the crabs had reached the bulwark, these intruders, whose bodies were bloated, twisted and transformed by foul witchcraft, were spotted by a sole sailor who had leant over to the side to see what had caused the ship to reel. He mumbled, stumbled and yelled, "All hands away!" These were his last words. The unfortunate fellow was quickly plucked, dismembered, and his remains trampled over as this fearsome, crustaceous onslaught swarmed over the deck of the ship. The rest of the crew were overwhelmed just as easily. A few threw themselves over starboard and into the sea. A few leapt down the hatches and tried to close them, but the crabs were too quick and too strong, and they immediately forced their way down below. All was carnage. Most of the crew died before they were truly awake. The whole port side of the ship was now crawling and writhing with crabs, and the ship was finally pulled so far over that the sea swept over and into her belly. She sunk in seconds. The ship dropped to the bottom of the sea, and the crabs continued biting and carving their way through each deck, grabbing anything and everything stashed in chests, barrels and boxes. And as the ship was a pirate raider, she had much booty stashed in her hold. When the grim ransack of the ship was fully complete, and the treasures brought back and deposited in catacombs under the lighthouse, the crabs heard the call of their master and returned to the wreck to feast. This was their reward. They had become accustomed to the taste of pirate flesh over the last few months. From the start to the finish, from the summoning to the release, the sorcerer had been drunk and dizzy with an eldritch power that sought to contaminate and control his otherwise orderly mind. He eventually called a halt to his malevolent spell, and he slumped to the floor, trembling from more than just the cold. After 5 minutes of lying atop the lighthouse, curled into a ball, he struggled to his feet, and then stumbled and staggered over to the trapdoor that led down inside. He wrenched it open, and half climbed, half fell, down the steps within.
Chapter 4, A Relic of Lost Civilization.
Vermin, a creature that revels in filth, a creature of no worth. Yet this creature is the start of a journey, from boy to man, from famulus to magus, from innocence to corruption. So the journey of the sorcerer starts. The puppet master in his tower awaits his puppet.
7 years earlier. High atop a hill, in the middle of the sprawling city of Yardsel-on-the-Mean, sits a very large and very ancient stone machine. This machine turned, thumped, grated and pounded. It had done so for over 600 years, for that is the age of the city. Yet, if truth were known, this machine celebrated its 8,432nd birthday this year. Only a select few knew this fact, and those that did wouldn't reveal such knowledge to anyone, even on pain of death. For death holds no fear to those who think death has no hold over them. The citizens who lived in Upper Yardsel-on-the-Mean gave this machine the grand title of Tonari Lapicora. Those that lived further down the hill, and everyone else for that matter, simply called it the clock. A strange name indeed, when no one knew what time or events this supposed clock was measuring. This Tonari Lapicora comprised of numerous stone parts, cogs, pistons, wheels, screws, and all manner of indescribable shapes. These parts continuously rotated, slid, shifted, and interlocked noisily with each other. For those that had viewed this machine, most became mesmerized and were known to stand, mouths agape, and expressions vacant, for minutes, hours, and even days at this most remarkable contraption. 611 years previously, the first settlers constructed a simple house to protect the clock from the elements, or more importantly, from prying eyes. This house had been nothing more than a tent, a very large leather tarpaulin stretched over a ring of 29 very tall poles. As the years passed, wood replaced leather, and stone replaced wood, and the house was given a new name to reflect its new grandeur. It now bore the title of the Domus. Not content with hiding the clock away in the dark, a very tall and very wide stone wall was raised around the bottom of the hill. A single gate provided the only access through this wall. From here, a winding path snaked up the hill to the stone construction of the Domus, which in turn provided the only entrance to the clock. Not long after, another wall was built. This one was even taller and wider, and was built around the first. It also boasted a gatehouse, complete with massive iron doors, a portcullis, and a moat. It was almost 100 years later, still, when a third and final wall was erected, and as befitting the grand plans and ego of the king at that time, this wall was the largest yet. In addition to a larger gatehouse, larger portcullis, more massive doors, and a deeper moat, it boasted a dozen towers, complete with ramparts, counterforts, machicolations, and even platforms for catapults. Despite all these enhancements and expansions, never in the 600 years of Yardsel-on-the-Mean's existence had the clock ever been attacked, threatened, or even so much as suffered at the tail end of a careless bird. 5 elderly scholars, each clutching scrolls and books on mathematics, architecture, and divination, stood and stared at the clock with the familiar gawping expression that had inspired in all its visitors. Their forefathers before them, over 600 years ago, had also stood in the same spot with the same look of wonder and puzzlement. And yet, despite the constant attention, one massive stone house, 3 walls, and 6 centuries later, only one creature had found a practical use of the Tanora Lapicora, and it was nestled upon a cog within a housing, happily asleep and rotating within the core of the machinery. 2 soldiers clad in the blackened steel breastplates of the city's guard, and sporting tabards showing a black eye upon a green hill against a white background, stood sentry next to the huge stone door that led into the clock's prison. Both wore full-face helmets and carried spears and large kite-shaped shields. The shields bore the same design as their tabards. The taller of the 2 turned and looked at his companion.
"It is time,"
he declared. His visor gave his words a slight echo. The companion, shorter by a head, nodded and pushed open the vast stone door that led through to the clock. One of the 5 scholars turned and faced the awaiting guard, his daydream broken by the clink-clank of the guard's steel shoes. He turned to his 4 companions and cleared his throat. Once, twice, coughed, coughed louder, stamped his feet, and there finally cried out aloud. This eventually gained the attention of his peers, and now finally awoken from their stupor, his companions turned towards him, shook their heads to clear their bewilderment, and shuffled out towards the exit. A gust of wind swirled through the domes as the last of the scholars left. It sent this scholar's loose papers spiralling up away from his outstretched arms. Within a few seconds, his 4 companions and the 2 guards had all joined in the fretful task of trying to catch and collect all the scattered papers. No one noticed the single sheet hurtle back through the open door. This solitary sheet of parchment pitched and dipped towards the clock, and then towards its largest cog. This cog was as wide as a house, and tilted at a seemingly impossible angle. The sheet skipped off its surface once, then twice, before coming to a temporary rest. As the cog continued to turn, the sheet of paper now found itself sliding and slipping around other parts of the clock. Moments later, it was chewed up by other cogs, pounded by pistons, and reduced to countless scraps and tatters. Most of the scraps found their way to the floor. The rest were carried through the machinery, through several cycles, being gradually mashed to a pulp. One particular scrap took a fortuitous route, avoiding being shredded, pounded, and minced. As it toppled and tumbled towards the clock's core, it eventually came to a rest with a nudge against the back of a cockroach. This cockroach was as big as a plum, though considerably flatter, and the colour of a chestnut. The instrument of fate stirred. Born and bred from generations of unsquashed cockroaches, it knew both where to scuttle and where not to tarry within the clock. Now rudely awakened and peckish, scratched a leg across its antenna, shook out its wings, and took to the air. Setting a meandering course, it avoided spinning wheels, grinding cogs, and stamping pistons as it buzzed towards the open portal and out to the sprawling city below. Through the combined efforts of the 5 scholars and the 2 guards, all the papers that remained in the vicinity of the exit had been gathered. A stray few had found freedom, flip-flapping in the blustery wind and floating off down the hill. Seeing that the commotion had been brought to an end, the shorter of the 2 guards moved to the door and started to push it shut. The roach, sensing his escape route narrowing by the second, buzzed the louder and began, and hurtled through the crack at top speed, striking one guard firmly on the forehead with an audible dink. The guard stumbled back and grunted with surprise. His companion, the taller of the 2, was handing the last of the recovered scrolls back to the red-faced scholar. The scholar scowled as he put his finger through a hole in the paper that the guard's spear had made, This guard, with his visor currently raised, smiled insincerely in mock apology. The cockcrow buzzed onwards. Drawn by the smell of something sweet in the air, the roach flew down the hill, meeting a chain of robe-wearing pilgrims crawling up it. The pilgrims, a brotherhood of monks from some distant land, came armed with prayer sticks and smoking censers. Now a cockroach is not gifted with the best of eyesight, so by the time it had detected an absence of anything edible and the presence of something harmful, it had already buzzed in their midst, bouncing off a pair of censers and numerous bodies. Some of the pilgrims temporarily abandoned their task of diligently rapping their neighbours' heads with their prayer sticks, trying instead to swat the tiny assailant away. But the roach veered and swayed and made good its escape, leaving the pilgrims flapping and uttering nonsense about omens in its wake. On it flew,